a model I was going to give earlier, a way that I've been listening recently that I really like. I have this model of what I call the relating languages. And as I've been working with students over time, something that I've noticed is that us in like the conscious relating field, we have this idea that the correct way to listen is to be receptive. Like if people are listening to us, they're asking questions, they're being quiet, so, and that's one form of listening. And then we get in conversation with people where we're like, they just talk so fucking much. Like they're just not listening at all. Like they just keep telling stories. They keep challenging my viewpoints. Like what is going on with it? And those people are thinking inside their heads, well, this person never tells me about themselves. They're just asking me questions all the time, or they're just waiting for me to maybe ask them something. Like, why is it they'll never volunteer information? Why are they judging me so much for my way of being? And I've actually started thinking that there are 4 different languages that people tend to speak when they're relating, 2 of which are more receptive, so questioning and observing, and 2 of which are more expressive, storytelling and challenging. And so we can listen for how someone is speaking and how they expect to be met. Because maybe with you, I try out some questions. I'm like, how do you respond when I just ask you questions? Do you ever ask me them back? Do you take it as overly intrusive? Does it make you light up and become alive more? How do you react when I'm a little more quiet and I'm observing and I'm just listening for like, what are the insights that I can bring, or what are the things that I can notice in my body, in your body, in the connection? Like I'm only going to speak when I really feel called to. Or on the other side, like storytelling, what happens if I tell you about my experience? The story I just told a minute ago about the violent interaction, like, does that spark something new in you? We're doing a lot of that here with each other. Actually, we're trading ideas and they're pinging off of each other. And there's a lot of excitement. If you were a type of interviewer that just stopped and asked me questions, this would be a really different conversation. Not necessarily a better or worse one, but very different. And then challenging is like, I love the back and forth. Like I'm going to be like looking for, okay, where can I meet you in this conversation? Where can I like bring my views back to you, but in a way that's kind of high intensity and engagement, oftentimes speaking for less long periods of time than the storyteller, and more about finding the point of intersection than making a point. And we can try these on in any interaction because what somebody is listening for and how they want to be listened to and what they even interpret as listening is really different. A storyteller doesn't necessarily interpret listening as just constantly asking them questions. They might interpret listening as, did you like pick up on something really interesting to tell a story about yourself? A challenger might be like, well, you're not listening to me by just being quiet and commenting on the things I'm saying. You're listening to me if you're like willing to contact me and you're willing to like come back at me and challenge my views. Those people can even seem like bullies sometimes because they're looking to be met. So I'm starting to see listening as this very nuanced thing that has to do with being able to be quiet enough in the conversation in my mind to receive the other person, but to receive not only their words, but what's going on underneath and their expectations and their culture and the nuance of who they are, which oftentimes has to be developed over a long relationship because there's so many variables and it's hard to get all of them right away. I have to be constantly listening and trying things and being with. And for me, that's one of the most fascinating processes imaginable. Like it can seem tiring, but in reality, it's like every conversation is a whole world of interest to be explored.
Do people so you're talking about intentionally being able to like understand what relating style someone's in and finding the appropriate way to meet them.
Mm-hmm.
So you're switching hats. Like, do
Mm-hmm.
other people switch hats, conscious of it or not? Like, I notice sometimes I'm into a challenge, and other times I want to tell a story, and other times I just want to hear a story, and other times I just want someone to like listen to me and ask me questions that help me better understand what I'm going through. So do we switch styles as well, like intuitively?
Absolutely. Yeah. So as far as I'm finding from doing research on this thus far, I came up with this about 1.5 years ago, and I've been working with a couple different researchers and developing a quiz and digging into like the particulars of it. most people have a language or languages that they err towards when they feel stressed, like when they feel like they need to protect themselves or they're in a somewhat unsafe situation, and languages that they use when they feel safe and comfortable around other people. In fact, there's kind of three. There's like, I feel fully safe and I'm just like in my body and with you and like not self-monitoring. There's self-monitoring, which is like, I'm a little back in my head. I'm watching what I'm saying. There's kind of like a social appropriateness. And then there's stress, which is like, I'm like way behind myself now. I'm like, I just can't even. I'm like, telling stories and monologuing because I want to fill up the space, or I'm, asking questions rapid fire because I don't want the other person to get a chance to speak, whatever it is. And then there's also situational change, which is even beyond those orientations, which we develop somewhat based on personality, but a lot more based on nurture, like what works in our families and in our friend groups growing up. There's also situation. So sometimes I'll be in connection with a certain type of person, or I'll be in a certain mode of myself where I need to be received in a way. And then I might shift into a different language. The developmental nature of that system is being able to shift, being able to understand what languages others are speaking and meet them, but also be able to be fluid in my own communication. The last piece of this is each of the languages also has a more like internal and more external spectrum to it. So I can speak the language as being more inside myself, like oftentimes a little more mental, like trying to get my point across, but also being able to have a little more boundary of self, which can be really helpful because, for instance, if I meet a more internal, this is a spectrum, by the way, not a binary. If I meet a storyteller that's more internal, who might talk for a fair amount of time, not necessarily that aware of how the other person in the conversation is reacting. They don't have a ton of attention out. They want to get the facts right. If I meet them with a very externally oriented style, like if I'm asking questions and I'm totally in their world over there, I'm tracking all of their expressions, I'm more embodied. I'm like, okay, let me just, I want to help them unfold in some way. It's going to create like a really high binary in the conversation. Like I'm always going to be asking questions and they're always just going to be telling the story because they're not tracking me and I'm totally tracking them. So the one benefit of the internal style is if you notice someone that doesn't have as much attention on you or much engagement, you might choose to do more internal style as well, where you're like, cool, like this person isn't tracking me as much. What can I get from this conversation with them? Like, what am I interested in? I'm just going to start asking them questions as a scientist, I'm just going to ask you things that interest me. I'm going to be more likely to interrupt. And they're not going to probably get as offended by that because they're not like that social dynamic in that moment is not as important to them. So there's a lot of nuance that we can play with consciously or unconsciously in this sort of model and in any model that you go with, but being able to manipulate those spectrums and make choices about the conversation and choices about how I'm engaging and how much of my attention is inside myself versus on the other person, like we talked about way earlier in this conversation, and what style I'm using can be just super powerful for having good interactions.